Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Today is August 1st. This is the meeting of the AI Advisory Council for the state of Vermont. We are recording and transcribing, so thank you in advance for speaking slowly and clearly. And we are going to begin with introductions. I'll begin. I'm Susanna Davis, a chair of the council and representative from the Office of Racial Equity. I think that we are too grown for me to call on everyone, so I'm going to invite members of the council to go ahead and unmute in an orderly fashion and introduce themselves.
I'm Mark Holmes. I'm co-chair of this council, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the Agency of Digital Services.
Friday, all. My name is Jess Vintner. I'm the Agency of Commerce and Community Development designee on the council.
I'm Joe Neer. I'm from the University of Vermont, and I'm representing the ACLU.
Christopher Curtis, Assistant Attorney General representing the Attorney General's office.
Ron, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm just trying to find my unmute. Ron LaFawn, I'm director here at the Vermont Homeland Security Unit, and I represent DPS.
I'm Phil Sussman. I'm the governor's appointee.
Last call for council members.
Oh,
Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say Amanda Jones. I'm the representative from Health and Director of Informatics.
I believe that's all the counselors who are currently on.
Great. It looks like we also have some other interested parties on the line as well. We are going to make sure that we have time for public comment. We're going to save that at the end. And just as a reminder, it's the council's policy that we ask people to limit their public comment to about 2 minutes. Of course, it's going to be time dependent. But we also recognize you all have a lot of good expertise to share. So if along the way in the conversation, you've got something burning that you got to let us know. We're also going to be watching the chat. And if you need to unmute, we can probably make that happen. I did post an agenda in the chat at about 1:38, but I understand that we have some modifications to it. So I'm going to invite Miles to share if there is an updated agenda. And actually, has this group yet been formally introduced to Miles?
Oh, I'll take care of that. Hey, I'm Josiah Raish. I'm the Chief Data and AI Officer, and until I guess the June meeting was also acting as the AI Director. I'm very excited to now introduce you to the state's AI Director, Miles. So Miles has a lot of experience with AI implementation at a company that was using AI in the context of litigation and things like that. And I'll let him talk a tiny bit about his background, but I'm really excited to have him join us. I'm not going to disappear. I'll still be around, but Miles will be running going forward. And he is going to be focused more on the internal adoption and implementation of AI inside state government. And I'm going to remain involved in the policy side and steering the kind of collaboration between the broader data group and the AI group. So I'll still be here, but Miles will be driving agendas from here on out. So Miles, over to you.
All right. Well, it's wonderful to meet you all. And thank you, Josiah, for the introduction. As Josiah mentioned, I'm the new Director of Artificial Intelligence. I'm joining ADS here from working for around the past 5 years in the private sector for a quant consulting firm. I was the Director of Engineering, and we focused predominantly on doing statistical and econometric analyses in support of antitrust litigation. So my engineering team specifically, we were responsible for handling the data processing and manipulations that were necessary to produce clean output data sets that our testifying experts could use for their analytical approaches. As part of that, we got to a point where we were using AI very extensively for a lot of our mundane and repeatable data intake processes, things like interpreting complex nested JSON files in different file formats, where for a human, taking the time to understand the format and write accordant code to parse it can take a really long time. But with that type of structured data, solutions like AI are extremely effective. So yes, it's an honor to be here, and I'm really excited to be a part of the team, and I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more about my priorities and goals over the coming months. Great. Thank
Welcome
you.
aboard.
Thank you.
You have a good team over there, so.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been really impressed by everybody's competency and motivation so far. ADS is a wonderful organization. Let's see. So I have the PowerPoint that I just posted in the meeting chat. It doesn't look like I have the permission to share my screen though.
Let me fix that. Sorry
Okay.
about that. Okay, you should be able to present now.
Great. Yes, looks like I can.
And it looks like John just joined the meeting. So John, do you want to say your name and role for the record?
Sure. I'm John Cohn. I work at Beta Technologies. I'm here representing the Vermont Academy of Science and Engineering.
Wonderful to meet you, John. I'm Miles. I just briefly introduced myself, but I'm the new Director of Artificial Intelligence here with ADS.
That is so cool. We're so happy to have you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. So looks like you can all see my screen okay. Yeah. Move down to our agenda slide. This is largely congruent with the agenda that I previously posted. I just made a couple of minor changes. So we went over our introductions. I understand that we need to approve the minutes for 2 prior meetings and then last month's meeting. So after this slide, I'll hand it off so that we can do that before continuing. And then I had some updates that I wanted to share regarding our federal regulatory landscape, some questions regarding the continuation of the conversation you've previously had regarding artificial intelligence procurement guidance, some updates to our AI policies for the state of Vermont. And then lastly, before turning it over to public comment, I just wanted to briefly discuss some ongoing AI trends that are relevant to some of the policy discussions that we're considering here. So with that, I don't have a slide for the approval of minutes because I wasn't sure specifically which meetings need to be approved, but I would be happy to move on to doing that.
Yeah, I think it's just June this time. So I don't know, Susanna, if you want to drive that.
Yep. So for those who want to quickly review them again, the June meeting minutes drafted are in the chat. When you all are ready, we will take a motion on what to do with them.
I make the motion that we approve them at this time. I don't see any changes that need to be made.
I will second.
Great. Motion by Mark, second by Jess. Any discussion? All right, all in favor, please say aye or raise a hand.
Aye.
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 All right, all opposed, please say nay. Abstentions, please say abstain. All right, June meeting minutes approved. Thank you all.
Thank you all. So before we proceed in more detail, I just wanted to give a brief update on some federal regulatory developments. I know that you previously discussed the proposed 10-year moratorium on AI legislation that was temporarily part of the reconciliation bill before being dropped. Last week, the White House released this new document, America's AI Plan of Action, which is a strategic framework intended to guide AI policy. Rather than pursuing statutory limitations on state legislation, this strategic policy framework is where the idea of limiting state legislation now sits. So as part of the first pillar of the framework to remove burdensome regulations, federal agencies with discretionary funding programs related to AI are now being directed to consider state regulatory climates when they make funding decisions, and to limit funding for any state that has an unduly burdensome regulatory environment. Because the AI laws that we have on the books are very narrowly defined, I don't think that this is presently a significant risk. Relatedly, the FCC is also being directed to review state regulations to ensure that they don't interfere with that agency's mandate. This also, as of now, does not really apply to Vermont, in my opinion. As an example, this FCC guidance could apply to any state data localization requirements, such as regulations mandating that AI-related data be stored and processed in state boundaries. Again, we don't have anything that would apply here, and given that we're such a small state, I don't think that those types of laws are going to be a legislative priority. But I thought that this, this new framework would be something to keep in mind moving forward. So before we proceed, does anybody have any questions here, either about these specific components of the plan of action or the document as a whole?
Or if any counselors have already been interacting on this plan. I know, Phil, you interact with federal stuff a fair bit, and John, you might have talked to me as well, but feel free to add a comment there. Go ahead, Mark.
Given that we know that there, like as it states, that the FCC is evaluating state regulations at this point, is there a feedback loop, or is there any kind of is there any sort of a formalized process for the states themselves to participate in that discussion, or no?
Not as specified in the document. It says the precise language is led by the Federal Communications Commission, evaluate whether state AI regulations interfere with the agency's ability to carry out its obligations and authorities under the Communications Act of 1934. So it doesn't go into any additional detail on the procedure or feedback besides that.
It's also not clear to me what that, tying AI to a law in 1934 is a bit of a surprise to me. So it's not clear to me what exactly they're trying to accomplish there, but we're still keeping an eye on that. And I don't know, Chris, if you've looked at that at all, but maybe that's a place that we can dive into sometime in the next few weeks.
I think the primary concern around any AI development tools, and there's an increasing body of literature out there that's just widely publicly available, is the security risks associated with AI that include everything from training modules that are pulling data into their systems that may be corrupted or may implant, malicious terms or code into those algorithms, and also just risk of exposure, and the fact that at least according to some literature, it sounds like there's an increasing risk that breaches might come from even innocuous searches that pull data that should have somehow been protected but ultimately weren't. And I note that that's reflected somewhat in the proposals that are before this council, restricting access to, for example, personal health data, other types of sensitive data, and sort of firewalling that off. But I think there is a concern and a risk, both in the private sector and in public institutions, that exposure and data breach, which is already rampant throughout industry and certainly to some extent in public bodies, like the rapidly changing nature and deployment of these AI tools in the absence of very, very serious and strict controls on the data that's being pulled and used has the potential to be, at best problematic and at worst catastrophic. So do with that as you will, but that's a concern, certainly.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any thoughts or questions?
Nothing has been structured in terms of what it will look like, but it appears that there may be opportunities for education, training, innovation hubs, other things that may come out of this regulation over time. But of course, there's nothing yet other than the executive order. But it's something to watch for, and maybe something for us to think about from a state as how we want to engage with or support the evolution of this technology. Over.
Thank you for that.
Phil, would that be...
Go ahead.
Sorry. Phil, would that be kind of in the purview of this as yet to be really kicked off education group, you think?
Well, I would think for sure the education group would look at the education training and how we might want to enhance that. There's also what appears to, again, this is a really high level plan. There are no resources put against it, but it also talks about, from an economic development standpoint or creating hubs or multi-state partnerships. There's a lot of other stuff that's in the doc, in the plan, but and hopefully we would want to think about how we would, as a state, position ourselves. And of course, John, the education would be a huge part. And yes, I need to meet with you again. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's not yours. Okay, no worries. Thanks. Kind of a good reminder for us. Yeah.
Yeah, I did also see, with regards to education, one of the directives in the policy is the Department of Labor is going to be coordinating with states to explore how to identify and upskill workers that are at risk of future displacement due to AI. So yeah, I think that in terms of upskilling and AI literacy and skill development, there is also some potentially beneficial stuff in here that we should definitely keep an eye on. So thank you again for that. Anything else? So next, I just wanted to briefly talk over my current priorities with regards to what I'm aiming to do as the director of artificial intelligence here at the state. And so, but before we get into detail about what exactly we're working on, I just wanted to give a high-level overview of what I see as my two main priorities at the moment. So the first is increasing policy clarity and transparency surrounding our state government's use of AI. This is obviously a moving target given that the technology landscape is changing so rapidly. But for example, we're working on a policy that I'll talk about in more detail to differentiate the acceptable uses of ChatVT relative to the public models that are described in our AI guidelines. We're working with BGS and Jesse Morman's team, plus a few others, on a vendor questionnaire to gather more information about AI in relevant proposals. And that's an extension of the ongoing conversation that you've been having about mitigating procurement risk in the AI space. So we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. But the overall goal here, as I see it, is to make sure that our policies on the use and adoption of AI aren't necessarily prescriptive, but sufficiently apply our underlying principles to capture a broad enough scope of use cases and applications so that people within government, one, know how and where AI is being used within their systems, and two, have a clear sense of what uses are acceptable with the various tools that they're interacting with. This is also ultimately going to be foundational to expanding government-wide education on AI. But because education goals are influenced by policy, I wanted to make sure that we continue establishing a stable, consistent, and extensible policy foundation, that further education initiatives are going to be built on, if that makes sense. Concurrently, the second high-level priority is continuing to prepare for and facilitate this ongoing shift in AI implementation from standalone tools, like the power tool analogy that I know Josiah has used, moving towards more complex systems that incorporate AI, not only as a tool that end users interact with, but as a layer within a system that autonomously interacts with other various system subcomponents. So it's sort of a shared paradigm shift in terms of how AI is likely going to be used in the future, moving from something like a nail gun or a bandsaw more to a CNC machine, as an example. And I think in many respects, there's a little bit of tension here in the sense that highly specific detailed policies can impede flexibility and increase compliance burden across the government as that tech landscape continues to rapidly change, which is why I want to make sure that I'm looking at these two goals concurrently. So before talking about our procurement guidance updates in a little bit more detail, does anybody have any questions here?
I'll add one other thing for council to be aware of, and that is we've been working with a couple of agencies on bringing in AI folks to think about process within their agencies. So transportation is I think just about to make an offer, or maybe has already made an offer for someone to work with their groups on AI and business intelligence, and be thinking about and working with Miles and his team on how to incorporate AI into processes there. Agency of Education has somebody who is doing similar work, who I think will be joining us for future meetings. So I think that's very exciting to have people thinking about AI use kind of in the context of their processes and in the context of the work of their agencies. And I think that ties very nicely into the priorities that Miles has laid out.
So this is just a summary of our function at ADS and the procurement process from your previous discussions. I know Josiah previously described the procurement advisory team and ADS's role at a higher level overseeing all IT procurement. But I know you also discussed that this is fundamentally complicated by the increasing incorporation of AI into vendor proposals that don't necessarily fall within the scope of IT projects alone. So with that in mind, these are also the main risks that you previously discussed regarding the potential vendor use of AI. And in turn, these are the high-level risks that we're seeking to mitigate. To help do that, as I mentioned, we coordinated with BGS and Jesse Morman's team to draft an AI disclosure questionnaire that will be included in pertinent RFPs. The high-level aim is to make sure that we understand which vendors are using AI and what their precise function will be, so that we can ask more detailed questions if needed, if we establish that there's a sufficient risk potential. So what specifically that looks like in this current draft format is that our goal essentially is to first gather enough info to gain a high-level understanding of the AI usage and the accordant risk, without at the same time burdening small vendors who may use out-of-the-box AI as part of some process that has a low risk profile and only makes minor, transient, and reversible decisions. So the questionnaire first evaluates three main questions. The first is what specific AI technologies are being used, and then the nature and scope of their intended function. The second is what specific decisions the AI system will make, and critically, whether or not it makes any automated final decisions. And then thirdly, how and to what extent those decisions are evaluated by humans. So our hope is that by gathering that initial information for all vendors who are using AI, we can determine whether a given proposal is complex or has a significant enough risk profile to ask more detailed questions. And those more detailed questions, oh, go ahead.
I guess the thing that I'm worried about is that, there's no standard for disclosing whether a tool like, let's say, Adobe Illustrator has AI features. It is not a guarantee that the person who's supposed to answer this question knows whether the tool involves AI, and there's no standard for disclosure. How do we handle that? You know what I mean? It's not like AI inside labeling is standard, and somebody who may not be sophisticated in AI, but maybe is a great artist, doesn't know that her or his tool has it. How do we handle that?
Yeah, let me contextualize a little bit more where we're talking about using this. So we'd use this in the RFP process. So this is where we've asked particular whatever the thing is that we're trying to buy, and then people are coming back with proposals. That's the moment where we are interested in plugging this in, and it is much more about not when we're buying a particular like widget, but when we're buying ongoing services. So we're really focused in service base. So I guess one example that came up recently was we wanted to have like a transcription and closed captioning service for public meetings to enhance accessibility. I think it was maybe for Department of Aging and Independent Living. I can't remember which agency it was, but I think it was that one. And they got a bunch of proposals back that were traditional captioning services. And then they also got some back that were like, we can just do this with AI. Here's how we do it. Here's how it plugs in. And so that's where we're thinking about plugging this in. It is mostly where we're getting some sort of services, and we want to know, like, if somebody's like, we want to do this using AI, we want to be able to be like, okay, add this information to it to help us to evaluate whether that's a good fit or not. And so that'd be one example. We've had a few, I guess there's just stuff like that where one was another one recently was a training provider. They wanted to provide feedback to people who are being trained to do certain types of interviews. And normally we do that with coaches. And one of the proposals that came back was something like, well, we could use AI to do that. We have a custom AI tool that can provide this type of feedback in real time.
My question stands though. I understand the distinction. Thank you for that. So I understand when there's an RFP and somebody's making a proposal, but in this day and age, so many things have embedded, every Microsoft project, everything like that. So it wouldn't necessarily even reach your door as a procurement. And it has all the risks and potential benefits of it coming in the front door. So I guess my question is, how do we handle, as a matter of fact, I'm going to say that most of the things that actually may have an issue here would be something that isn't explicitly an AI tool. It's some other sort of widget. So what is the process for that? I know I'm asking not the question you're answering, but it seems to me that that's an old-fashioned view of procurement, like a centralized IT organization comes in and there's a vendor. But more and more, I think so much stuff, so much function is getting moved into these tools because of the capability of AI, and people may not even recognize it as AI. How do you plug that leak if it's a leak?
So I think that this reminds me a little bit of a conversation that I had earlier today with Jacob Durrell about the RFP attachments that we have and various clauses and how we can ensure that respondents, who sign a contract are actually being honest, when they read through the dozens of pages and say like, oh yeah, we have a whistleblower protection program in place for our company, for example. How do we verify that that is actually the case beyond, just evaluating things on a case by case basis? I think, the point that you make that a lot of the components of bids that have significant risk here, they may not be elements or bids where AI is a central focus, and you make a good point that especially for small vendors or vendors who aren't particularly technically proficient, that they may not even know that the software applications that they're using present any AI risk. And in terms of how to mitigate that beyond asking, I don't have a clear answer at this point. I think that we can use our experience and technical proficiency to value or to closely evaluate the proposals. As time goes on, I think that vendors who answer no as to whether or not they're using AI for a solution, we can compare that to the contemporary technical landscape for whatever the field is, be it AI trend or be it transcription, like the example that Josiah gave, where a couple years down the line, if we put out a similar bid and a vendor responds and says that they're not using any AI in the process of providing a transcription solution, that may just be an indicator that we need to scrutinize those proposals more closely and make sure that that's actually the case. So yeah, I know that that's not a direct answer, but that's all to say that I think that that's still a very open-ended question, and I would be curious to hear if anybody else has any ideas, from a compliance adherence perspective.
A little bit of human judgment is what I heard you say, which makes all the sense in the world.
So we at this point in the process are not trying to evaluate their AI system. I think at this point in the process, it's really just a question of transparency, right? So tell us, do you have it or don't you? Because we will, through the RFP process, also have things such as non-functional requirements, which we can get into in more detail. But we have requirements in the RFPs and comments in the RFPs that allows them to elaborate, and we can get more specific about the questions and that we need to ask. And there's obvious we've got them today within some of our data sharing agreements and things like that. But I think at this point, it's just establishing that we're going to have a consistent policy up front of asking, and just for that point of transparency, right?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that is well said and makes sense. So beyond the complex outstanding question of how to ensure that vendors are being transparent in answering these questions, does anybody have any other thoughts on either the contents that I highlighted here or the questions as a whole? I know that this is something that we're moving towards trying to get finalized sooner. So if you have any feedback or thoughts regarding the document in any capacity, I would love to hear those.
When these things that you have on the right hand side, do you see those being, what I was terming non-functional requirements that are, pulled in as relevant?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I would chime in just a little bit here. So yes, the reason that we're asking these specific questions up front is it helps us to get to that fourth bullet point over there. Do we need additional information? Do we need to go deep during the later parts of the RFP process? Because there's going to be, as a result of these handful of questions, there's going to be some that just this is not a good fit for us right now. There's going to be some where it's going to be, yep, that's fine. They're using, because we also require them to say, we're going to use the tools in compliance with the code of ethics and things like that. So like we're trying to separate things into 3 buckets: the definitely no's, the definitely yeses, and the go deeper. And the goal is to come up with a set of questions that helps us reliably get things into one of those 3 buckets without doing a lot of without requiring the vendor to do a lot of work and without requiring us to do like a deep dive on every single one. So that's like, I think the specific questions are going to evolve over time for sure. But that's what we're trying to hit. And I also want to recognize Chris's question in the chat about, could we require that somebody has security, governance, and access controls? We do require those, but there are certain cases where, for example, the bias testing is super relevant in some use cases and not in others. So those are some of the types of questions that we're trying to ask. The things that can't just be it's always got to be this way. We need to have a little bit more detail in order to answer those questions.
Thank you, Josiah.
I think, Miles, you sent around the document as a read ahead, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So did anyone have feedback on that document? And we're happy to take, feedback as comments after the meeting, or if folks have any feedback now, we'd be happy to hear that too.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, if you do come up with anything at any point after the meeting, feel free to reach out anytime. I would welcome any thoughts or feedback that you have on the document. So before I move on, does anybody else have any thoughts or questions on disclosure requirements in the AI vendor procurement space? All right. So
Hello?
the next, oh, hello.
Yeah, I tried raising my hand. Maybe it's not working. I noticed the very last bullet or the very last section is post-deployment auditing and monitoring. And I know that I don't want to speak for Mark, but I'm sure that when Mark buys a tool, he actually sandboxes that tool to determine whether or not it's phoning home or doing some set of activities, transmitting data that they don't or expect. And I assume from this comment about post-deployment auditing and monitoring that during your install process or your implementation process, that there is going to be an element of, for lack of a better term, sandboxing to determine whether or not all of the things that you thought were true are true. I'm not suggesting vendors aren't truthful, but we found a lot of things in sandboxes, I would suggest.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah.
I mean, you're 100% correct, Phil, on new products that we're buying and in that deployment phase. I think if you go beyond that, though, I think there still extends the question of because we generally subscribe to things now. We don't just buy products and then install them on our servers, and it's more of a subscription based. And I think the risk is and we're using a tool today that has had it, like Microsoft Teams, when we first rolled it out, didn't have a lot of Copilot features built into it. We didn't really buy new teams and deploy new teams. It's just over time, as updates come about, there's been more AI in it. So I think there's still possibly a point of contracting where we need to state something like, the vendor needs to notify us within a certain period of time if there's any kinds of AI that's being introduced that we didn't previously evaluate or consider.
I would add to that the post-deployment monitoring that we're talking about here is less the cybersecurity flavored and more about outcome monitoring. So if we start using AI transcription, is it working well over the long haul? as they deliver kind of over the air updates to it. Is it continuing to get better? Or is it, starting to underperform? And really thinking about outcomes. That question, like in certain tools, will be a very cybersecurity flavored answer, but for many other tools, especially like in the human services space, it's going to be more about outcomes and is it behaving, like, is the tool having the outcomes that we expected, or is it underperforming relative to what we expected?
Thanks for that, Josiah. I really appreciate that definition there. That helps a lot, especially because we know that over time models change and the quality or value of them change. So thank you very much for that. And to Mark, I would just throw out, whenever we do large point changes in software, what's happened in the marketplace, at least from my perspective, is that we've been forced into, oh my goodness, we got to shove all these point pieces out there and let's see what breaks. And that was not the way we did it 20 years ago, but that makes me an old man, so I'll stop talking.
I feel you, so as an old person as well. So
Thank you all for your thoughts and questions here. Do we have anything else before we move on? Great. So next, I wanted to talk about the acceptable usage policy that I disseminated in draft format for ChatVT. Because we run ChatVT in an isolated environment and we have a zero data retention policy in effect, it is permissible and secure to use the tool with certain types of non-public and confidential data that are not allowed for upload to public tools under our guidelines for the use of generative AI. And we've had a couple of questions from DHR and AOE, just folks throughout the government over the past month about what specifically ChatVT can and cannot be used for. So I thought it would make sense to draft up a policy delineating that and explaining how the acceptable uses are different relative to the public models that are explained under the existing guidelines document. And so there are a few data prohibitions that are explicitly mentioned, specifically, HIPAA, PHI data, FTI, anything that has a statutory audit requirement is not allowed. But beyond that, I wanted to try to create sort of a broad and extensible policy for using other types of non-public information with ChatVT that would also hopefully be applicable to other internal tools that we may adopt down the line that have a similar security environment. This policy is specific to ChatVT in this draft format, but my long-term aim is to create a policy for internal tools to differentiate the allowable uses from public models like ChatGPT. And at a high level, the compliance workflow that I included in the document is basically just focused on, using judgment, getting managerial approval, deferring to our existing policy requirements in the AI guidelines and the code of ethics, and then reaching out to us if a user is unsure about whether or not a specific use case is allowable. So I know that there's already been at least, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to add a little bit to this. So the environment that we have ChatGPT running in is our Azure environment that we use for most of the rest of our workloads in the state. So what that means is that technically the environment itself and the processes that my team has around log management and things like that would make it capable of handling any of the data we can handle in that environment, which is basically everything except for CGIS data. That said, we have decided so that we don't have to go through the audit cycle and the federal review processes when we deploy new capabilities to the tool, that we don't want to use it for anything that requires a federal audit, just because it's still evolving fast enough that we want to stay off of that particular treadmill for now. So we've provided the guidance that like anything that would subject us to audits or the federal notification period before we can turn on features, we don't want that data in here. So that's where the MARZ, the HIPAA flavor of PHI, and the FTI get added to that list of prohibitions. What we're trying to do, though, is make clear to folks that it is okay to use data that does not fall into one of those categories within ChatVT only. They still can't use any sensitive data in public-facing models like, people like to use Google's Notebook LM to generate the podcasts, things like that. You can't put any non-public information in there. But in ChatVT, if you want to generate policies or procedures or guidance documents, things like that, that's okay because our ChatVT environment is safe to use with sensitive data. So that's what we're getting at with this slide and what we're trying to clarify for folks.
Thank you. And I saw, Christopher, you had a specific question about whether or not it would make sense to simply restrict, as I understand it here, all forms of potentially identifiable information as well as PHI, just to ensure that breach impacts are minimized. I come from an industry that is extremely focused on data security and regulatory compliance, given that we worked extensively with PHI data. So I would definitely understand that perspective. And I guess my question that I would pose to the group is whether or not there are use cases of potentially identifiable information, that would make the potentially elevated risk worthwhile, for use with ChatVT. Again, given what Josiah mentioned, that at a technical level, this is a secure environment. I put together a little example of authorized versus unauthorized use cases under the current guidance that I included in the draft. Some of them are a little bit goofy because they're all hypotheticals. But yeah, I guess my stance on it is that I wouldn't inherently oppose including a ban on all potentially identifiable or personally identifiable information. It just, it depends whether we want to make the rule set more prescriptive and restrictive of data uploads, or given the security environment, as long as a given use has a clear perceived benefit and is alignment with our generative AI guidelines and the code of ethics, is it okay? So yeah, I would be curious to hear everyone's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, in the examples that were cited in the draft, it just seemed like, PII in the examples cited wasn't even necessarily applicable. So if there's not a good use for it and it can just be firewalled or made to be exempt to begin with, it seems to me you would be going a long way to protecting citizens or anyone that has their information, personal or sensitive information, in a state of Vermont database. And of course, we all like to believe we operate in a secure environment. It's only secure until it's not. And so just, there are lots of sophisticated business entities out there who represent that they have the greatest security protocols, and then only to learn, oops, not so much. And I think increasingly too, of course, states and municipalities and other public actors will be the subject of attempted intrusions. And so it's just a major risk factor. And so, especially if you're just getting to a place of adopting a new technology and deploying it, why would you not adopt a precautionary protocol that says, at least at the outset, we're going to create these restrictions and prohibitions and take a wait and see approach. And then in the event that there is some kind of a breach, you're well protected and you're not going to have sort of risked anything at the outset.
Yeah,
Chris, I appreciate you raising that. And I think it is a good distinction to draw, Miles, as we're thinking about how this applies to ChatGPT versus other things. With ChatGPT, the only sensitive data that's in there is data that's kind of input by the user in the context of a prompt with that conversation, and it's locked to that conversation. It's not available to any other users, and it's not like it's not saved in the model anywhere, right? Like it's attached in the database in that one particular user. So I think that is a mitigation that we have in place that we can't assume is in place with other types of AI tools. Because like the fact that we don't store or retrieve the information across users, I think is a really important mitigation factor that makes it okay in this tool and not okay in other tools.
I think, Amanda kind of has a good point there. I think I think it's probably not as much just about stating what the policy is. I think it's, as you kind of just did, Josiah, given an illustration of why it's secure in this instance, right? And maybe doing that in something that's a little less technical, that like the average, state employee or person could understand along with it. I don't think it's a matter of changing the policy, though. I think it's just a matter of just adding the extra bit of education.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Christopher, I really appreciate your thoughts on PII data and this discussion regarding data security as a whole. I think it's definitely important to centrally keep in mind that data security is a combination of the technical and system safeguards, as well as just the principles that your users are adhering to in terms of in ensuring that identifiable data is not exposed to any unnecessary increased risk. And I know in the use case examples that I gave, I frankly struggled to find hypothetical use cases where personally identifiable information would actually be relevant for a given desired outcome. So I do think
that was
we
my
need
question. Like, what are people? Why would anybody be sort of trafficking this anyway, even on an individual basis? Like, what good would it use in a training model? So I guess absent that, it just struck me that like, why not just make it off limits to begin with? But I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean, if there's some reason for it.
This was one that has come up a couple of times where people want to do analysis of user feedback that comes in during comment periods or just the constituent engagement type things that happen, and we kind of handle each one of these things individually as things that come up. But then when you want to look back over the body of comments and concerns you've gotten over the course of 6 months or a year and use that to inform program design, that's a really common use case for generative AI. And in that you'll have people talking about, hey, this thing on my road. I guess one example that I remember is, once a year somebody goes off the road and wrecks my car in my driveway because of this corner geometry, and like they included enough there that you could tell exactly who that was. So that is identifiable information. Like they often include their name in those types of things. But really what we're trying to do is do sentiment analysis and kind of pull out aggregated information from the many specific anecdotes to drive broader policy or tactical discussions. So that's the kind of thing that people like to use generative AI for, and that can include personally identifiable information. It's not primarily because we're trying to do something with personally identifiable information. Mm-hmm. It's because that happens to be in there. It wouldn't be appropriate for them to use that in a like ChatGPT or another public tool, but is appropriate in ChatGPT.
That makes sense. And I know that de-identifying that type of data can be a significant, time and material effort, depending on how complex it is. So thank you for sharing that. That is a very good example. Let's see. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I'm thinking about is a lot of the work that we do in the Office of Racial Equity relies on qualitative and quantitative data regarding people of color in Vermont. And the trick with that is that there are so few of us that we're often rendered statistically insignificant in larger data sets. And so it's often the case that when we want information about something that happens at a town level, say, we often butt up against, oh, we can't give you that because it could be personally identifiable. One good example was at the onset of COVID, when we wanted to compare infection and death rates between different demographic groups in different areas of the state. And they would give us county level data disaggregated by race, but not town level, which is not helpful, right? Because, okay, Chittenden, but Chittenden is not the same in all of its areas in terms of demographics. So I guess for me, I'm thinking about what is a use in which we want to engage with data that may relate to small populations and might be considered personally identifiable, but that may be useful in the legitimate answering of a research question or something. And maybe, I mean, I'm wrestling with that because I'm not certain if that is really within the bounds of the tool we're talking about or what. So I don't think this is a question. I'm not certain that what I've just said is a question, but if you have an answer, that'd be great.
Susanna, can I ask a question about that? I mean, that's a
Yeah.
really valid concern. So is the idea that there would be so few people in a particular area of a particular demographic that if you answered the number, you would know who it was?
Yeah, basically, I mean, that's often the explanation we get on a number of different things of data. So I'm just thinking if we were to use, for example, ChatGPT to analyze, I don't know, results of something, is that the kind of thing that you can sort of backdoor your way into identifying individuals? And if that's the case, back to the ethical question, is the resulting analysis worth that potential risk, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah. Back in my last job, we had the same kind of issue, much lower stakes, but it was on employee survey information. And we wanted to, so it's kind of the same problem is if you had a group of employees, reporting to a manager and his or her employment's, got some bad comments, they didn't want it to be identifiable if that person only had one report. So what they did is that they chose a large enough aggregate. So they would say they would accumulate in layers of hierarchy. So in other words, I'm wondering if like you were doing a query by county, could you say, if I can't get 10 individuals in this query, I go up, I change the mileage radius or I change the search. So we figured out, so it was like a query that had to return at least this much. And if it didn't, we would aggregate more area on it. So it didn't increase the certainty. So in other words, it didn't allow you to drill down any further. And it wasn't a really hard kind of SQL thing to do, but maybe that's the idea. But I hear what you're saying is if it's not dangerous information, if it can't be misused, maybe that sophistication isn't worth it. But I think
Yeah, and I
just
mean,
to be clear, like there's a distinction between publicly available information. So like just name and address or name and description of the corner where you live, which would be found in land records, is not considered PII, at least for purposes of our statutory definitions. So I mean, we can talk about this later, but I just think like there is a distinction between how we govern and regulate quote unquote personally identifiable information, which is sensitive information to some extent, and publicly available information which agencies might have or contain or refer to, but that are generally available to any member of the public if you just simply conduct a basic search. So that I'm more focused on the PII itself, which is the subject of data breach and is typically more sensitive than what is otherwise considered publicly available information, which I think if you just said I think you could resolve the issue if you just said like PII and PHI, we're not going to consider that. That obviously leaves out publicly available information, which may be the subject of internal discussion or use of ChatVT, and may be entirely permissible and not subject to the same level of review or confidentiality.
I think that there's clearly a delineation between what's PII and what's not. I guess from a differential privacy thing is that armed with particular queries and publicly accessible things, like you might like an income map and then addresses, you could do a query that took public information and de-identified something that would have normally been PII. So it wasn't identifiable as PII overtly, but by combining query data or including publicly addressable stuff, you could de-identify something, is I think what you were saying, Shashank. But so I think it isn't simply a matter of identifying certain data just by saying, hey, it's not accessible, that it means that someone can't figure out a way of tricking a model to reveal it. That's what I'm trying to.
So, yeah. I think sadly, I live in this world of knowing the data itself, and so PII actually has two different values to them, and what's stated in that statute is accurate, but it's only those are the direct attributes. There's also indirect attributes of PII that are relevant, and I think that's really what comes into question. And it's probably worth us having a fuller conversation, and maybe generating some ideas offline and coming back to this. But it's really when you get to all those indirect things and you have a smart tool such as AI that can draw the lines between these indirects and then essentially create the picture, right? So maybe, Miles, and as a takeaway, we kind of do a little bit of a internal workshopping on this and come up with some good, bad examples to illustrate potential policy changes, and then come back next meeting.
Great. Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. And I know that we have a lot to think about in this regard. So yeah, let's definitely workshop that further. Let's see. I know that we're over time here. Does anybody else have any other thoughts or questions on this ChatVT acceptable usage point? All right.
So let's get back to the chairs for public comment, because I want to make sure that we get to that, and we can roll the MCP discussion to next time.
For sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
Marcus, Susanna,
Right. Yeah, if we have any members of the public who would like to address the council, please take this opportunity to do so, maybe on this topic, maybe on another topic. And if you'd prefer to do so in the chat, we will encourage you to type quickly and we will watch it. Just kidding, you don't have to type quickly. All right, well, you know where to find us. If you are typing, which it doesn't look like anyone is, but just in case something comes to you, then you can join us at our next meeting, or you can reach our new staff person, our new director, directly. Otherwise, I think that's it for today. Is there anything else that hasn't been said that must be said before we close? All right. Well, I've heard rumors that today is Friday, so I hope you all enjoy your weekend. And I do see one more comment in the chat from Phil Sussman. So I would encourage you all just to take a quick look at it so that we don't lose the thread and we can perhaps pick this back up at our next meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.